In the broadest interpretation, corruption can be defined as the abuse of public office for private gain. But what does that mean? Corruption is often a manipulation of rules set in place by governments and institutions in order to gain or sustain power, status, and wealth. It includes actions such as reallocating resources, nepotism, and bribery. There really can't be any precise definition that encompasses all actions, forms, and degrees of corruption considered illegal in every jurisdiction, but it is useful to use the following framework to identify the varying forms of corruption. The three common forms of corruption include grand, systemic, and petty corruption. Grand corruption is used to refer to corrupt practices present in the highest level of a national government and occurs when senior public officials accrue massive personal wealth through unprincipled and illicit means. This category includes manipulating election laws, campaign finance regulations, and conflict of interest rules for parliamentarians, as well as the way power is exercised. Most often, the presence of grand corruption leads to the erosion of trust in the government institution. When considering combating corruption internationally for the U.S. government, grand corruption is the most concerning type of corruption. Due to the power of the corruption actors participating at this level, grand corruption is often considered to determine the stability of the country and the prevalence of corruption in the lower levels of society. Systemic corruption includes widespread or systemic practices that undermine the integrity of an institution or public trust in an institution. This form of corruption is often the direct result of grand corruption and, like grand corruption, must be dealt with through transparency building and the implementation of rules. The major difference between grand and systemic corruption is that the former distorts the central functions of the government, whereas institutionalized corruption develops and exists within the context of established governments and social frameworks. It is important to note that at this level, the likelihood of detection and punishment often falls. Petty corruption focuses on low and mid-level government officials and involves the exchange of small amounts of money in return for favors or assigning positions with small responsibilities to friends or family. This form of corruption is not a concern when attempting to combat corruption on a large scale unless the petty actions lead to systemic or grand corruption. Another way to look at corruption and corruptive actions is from a chronological perspective. If the corruption is caught before the act took place, it's considered active corruption. If it's after, it's passive. This distinction is helpful when considering an incomplete corrupt act because active corruption includes cases where payment and/or the acceptance of a bribe has already occurred. If a bribe was offered and not accepted, or solicited but not paid, that would be passive corruption. When considering available tactics to fight potential and present corruption, one must consider once more a chronological framework. The two most influential approaches include anti-corruption and counter-corruption. Anti-corruption encompasses preemptive actions and reactions that focus on the development of leaders, organizations, and institutions. These actions are always implemented prior to the corrupt crime and include improving transparency, accountability, inspection, limiting opportunities for corruption, and influencing individual behavior. In practice, anti-corruption is used to combat grand and systemic corruption because it takes advantage of the preemptive and educational aspects of the countering corruption process. Conversely, the counter-corruption approach includes offensive action against corruption that has already happened. These types of actions should be the first option for the U.S. government when combating corruption. Building integrity can be used as an umbrella term for all of these actions, but it also emphasizes education on the effects of corruption. The three preconditions for effectively fighting corruption in war-torn countries include the establishment of relative security, development of political will to combat corruption, and public investment in the fight against corruption. Only once the preconditions set by the counter and anti-corruption framework are established is the counter-corruption or direct approach possible. This is because a system is required to assess the corrupt actions and prosecute the actor or actors before taking any sanctioning actions. After this stage, the host nation will be expected to maintain its own system for combating corruption. Once the host nation demonstrates competence in counter-corruption efforts and convicting corrupt actors, then a mixture of anti-corruption and counter-corruption efforts can be possible. At this point, it's up to the morals of the host nation to continue combating corruption.